My name is William Corless, and this is the Workplace Podcast. Brought to you in association with Yellowwood, providers of executive coaching, corporate training and facilitation. Your external learning and development partner. Each week we focus on a different aspect of the workplace. We hear from guest speakers who will be subject matter experts, who I believe are incredibly talented at what they do. These experts will give you a different perspective and insight to work life, with the aim of empowering you to take a different path to success in all aspects of work life. These perspectives will include career and personal success, leadership, high-performance teams, and creating a better work-life culture in your organisation. Yellowwood. Take a different path to success with your career, team, and organisation. Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Our topic today is managing and overcoming trauma. Our guest today is Dr Rashpal K Dhensa-Kahlon, or Razzie, as I know her. We met first in LSE. Isn't that right, Razzie?
We did. Many years ago now.
Exactly. You were my tutor in the organisation behaviour course that I undertook in the London School of Economics. Rashpal is a chartered psychologist and joined Birkbeck's Department of Organisational Psychology in the spring of 2021. She has earned her PhD in Organisational Behaviour and Employment Relations from the London School of Economics, and prior to joining Birkbeck, she worked at the University of Surrey. Before commencing her PhD, she worked in consulting, specialising in coaching, career transition, challenging interactions, issues and well-being, psychometric assessment and survey analysis. Her training in psychology and organisational behaviour underpins her research, teaching, as well as ongoing work in coaching and consulting. Today, we are going to talk about some of the research that Rashpal has conducted into how individuals manage challenging issues that can have a major impact on their lives, both at work and outside it. This includes studies of individuals who have been mistreated at work, who are faced with inequality, and individuals who are witness to traumatic societal events such as terror attacks. She has a particular interest in individual adjustment in the face of adversity, including processes around healing, care and growth. Most of her work utilises a mixed methods design. Rashpal continues to undertake commissioned research and consulting projects. She has recently completed research for the NHS on protected characteristics. Raji, so good to see you.
You too. I don't recognise myself from that brief, but yes.
And it's all true.
It is all true, yes.
It's wonderful. So where should we start? So there's a lot of research that you have done, conducted yourself, and I suppose have leveraged others' research. Where do you think we should begin this conversation? It is so fascinating how trauma is inside of work, outside of work, and especially all the societal issues that are going on at the moment. So where should we begin?
You know what, William? I think given where we're at historically right now, I don't think a day goes by without us talking about the pandemic or about COVID. So maybe a good starting point might be to consider that and some of the research which I'm just writing up now, which considers sort of the COVID, the pandemic, as a traumatic and stressful experience that globally so many of us are experiencing. So that might be a good place if we start big macro societal and then sort of work our way down. How does that sound?
That sounds great. So are we going to start from, we'll say, hospitals and your work with the NHS? Is that where we should begin?
No. Well, we'll come to that in a moment if you want to. But this is just a paper that I won some funding for last year through Birkbeck and through the Wellcome Strategic Fund. And what I wanted to do was to explore the traumatic impact on people of living through a pandemic. So many of us don't remember living through a pandemic unless we were exposed in any way to the SARS a few years ago, or one of the sort of smaller pandemics. This is the first time globally, and potentially since the Spanish flu, that everyone is going through various degrees, but the same boat. We're on the same boat here. We're all living through lockdowns. We're all living through lots of restrictions placed on our freedom to move around, to mix and intermingle with people that we work with or our loved ones. So I think when it comes to thinking about people's psyche, their conscience right now, I think globally, everyone is in the same boat. So what I was really interested in understanding is, what is the mental health impact of this collective global trauma? And so and this is all sort of, I have two interests. One is very organisational specific. One is a bit more macro and sort of societal specific. So this one falls into the sort of society bucket a little bit. And so for the past few months, it's been an interesting, albeit arduous journey of crunching through some data to try to understand the mental health impact of the couple of years of the lockdowns that the UK specifically has been through, compared to mental health rates the 10 years before. So one of the ways that we wanted to get a handle on, you hear all the time people referring to, and myself included, how hard lockdown has been. These past 2 years have been such a struggle for people in their own ways, having to be at home for prolonged periods of time. Just the mental health impact of having to look after children, teach them, stay employed, work, all sorts of crazy hours. The whole dynamic has shifted from what we're doing at home versus what we used to do outside. Curbs on our freedoms to go outside and mix and I guess, for want of a better phrase, be normal. And so the way in which I did this was asking a question. These 2 years of the pandemic, have they been detrimental to the UK mental health if we were to compare that to rates up to 10 years before, which give us a good insight into where sort of the rates are fluctuating or not. So I used a big data set called Understanding Society, and it's a longer panel survey of tens of thousands of citizens across the UK, and they complete surveys every couple of years. And they completed surveys regularly at 8 points during the last 2 years of COVID. We amalgamated that data, my colleagues and I, and Jackie's also on this paper, who you know quite well, with the previous 10 years. And we found some really, really interesting results. We found, for example, that mental health rates had dipped. If we look at the previous 2 years compared to the past 10 before 2020, there's a demonstrable difference in people being more mentally distressed. So it was interesting to read statistically that there was a difference there. People talk about it all the time in conversation. They often refer to how hard they're finding life, finding things, etc. So that was good to sort of put some science on some chats that we might have on a daily basis. But we drilled further, and this was some of the interesting results, which I'm writing up now. So I'm going to be quite loose about what we say before it goes into review. But we found that rates over the 2 years of lockdown, or just COVID years, let's call them, say 2020 and all of 2021 as well. We just call that COVID period. Mental health rates were lower by and large. They were lower for women. Women struggled more. Younger people struggled more. And we found those who were in various forms of education struggled more as well. What was really interesting is that we found that at every lockdown, so in the UK, for example, there have been 3 discernible lockdowns. At each and every lockdown, the rates dipped even more. So generally during the 2 years of COVID, mental health rates were lower, they were fluctuating, but every time there was a lockdown, they dipped even further. And I think that's, for a social scientist, that's interesting, but I guess for a human being, it's worrying that if we are to go into lockdown at any point in the future again, we really, really have to account for its impact on each and every one of us, and more so those who have children, are female, and are from certain ethnicities. They tend to struggle a little bit more. But also, I think some important messages that come off the back of this for public policy is there's a lot to deal with. William, you've probably heard too, right, that there's once the pandemic is done with, there's a mental health pandemic to deal with. Yeah. And I think that's the most interesting thing, that the most recent lockdown was not that long ago, really. And people don't just stop being affected mentally once lockdown is finished. Some of those distressing feelings that you have, they linger and they continue, and they can continue for years. And so I think what we're trying to wrangle through now is, what are the implications of this? There are clearly so many of us in society that are going to need a little bit more help to get back on our feet. So just some interesting conclusions being drawn from that. And that really links in with so many global researchers who have said that every time there's a collective traumatic event, I mean, a pandemic was the biggest one in our living memory globally. But if there's a terror attack, etc., it has a lingering impact on people. It doesn't just disappear when it stops, or whoever is held responsible is given a sentence, whatever it might be. These things linger. So it ties in quite neatly with global research on the impact of collective events on individual people. Things linger, they stay in. And so many of us need help with that at some point. So interesting conclusions there, but that's still being written up. So ask what you want. It might be a little bit dubious in how I reply, but that's sort of the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting that, while it's the pandemic here, it could be like a terror attack, or, for example, a war in Europe or something like that could have a major implication there. So this is what's going on is and I'm going to quote from Wendy Ryan's book. So I interviewed in a podcast a couple of episodes ago, and she talks about the demographics, which you're talking about, would say ethnicities and, women in the workplace and younger people, the environment, where people are concerned about climate change, politics, maybe technology or terror threats, and health. And there's all these different aspects where we can do that. And I'm curious then, as a collective then, is this trauma a form of post-traumatic stress then? Is this what's going on for us that's kind of staying there, which is maybe we haven't recovered or healed from? And if so, how do we move forward?
I think so, William. Without having research on that myself to testify specifically, I think it is a bit of post-traumatic stress as well. And that's the lingering effects of an event on people. And I think that a lot of people will walk around following the pandemic, following a terror attack, and they're relatively untouched. They're able to process things quickly, park them, not ruminate. But so many people are still thinking about it. They're thinking about what they lost during those times. They're thinking about what curbs on their freedoms did to their livelihood, to their lives at home with the people that they love. And for many people, processing that, making sense of it in such a way that you're able to continue life is really quite hard. And I think for these people, to varying degrees, the knock-on effect is it's not being able to sleep. It's about increased anxiety when you do go out. It's about that anxiety, or almost sort of terror management, thinking that something might go wrong, being heightened in an anxiety sort of sense, thinking that you might lose people quite easily. And that fear, possibly even the lack of hope about what might be around the corner. I think for a lot of people, those sentiments and those feelings will harbour for a long time. And that's those sort of underlying emotions that happen. They can then cause ongoing stressful situations for people. Thinking about these things all the time, being fearful, being anxious, etc., can make people physically unwell. It can lead to all sorts of complications over time, and psychologically it can be debilitating over a long period. Most people will recover quite quickly, William, I think a lot of us, now that we're heading into sort of freedoms, as they say here in the UK, restrictions are lifted, a lot of us have short-term memories. We'll think, right, this is great, back to normal. But for those people who have had more arduous experiences, losing loved ones, it's been quite traumatic in many ways. They've just interpreted not being able to do the normal things in quite a challenging way, being under huge pressure to stay at home, look after the home, being caregivers, losing work, managing work. I think for a lot of people, it takes a long time to make sense of that trauma, even if you'd say 6 months, 12 months, it is relatively short-lived. But I think, to answer your question, there are pockets of people who have struggled more. And research says time and time again that women who often shoulder the caregiving burdens have struggled a little bit more. People from various ethnicities have struggled a little bit more. People from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds have struggled a little bit more. And for them, I think, perhaps the journey might be even more debilitating, and they're in even more need of sort of mental health resources to get back on their feet. Yeah.
It seems like it's a vicious cycle, because if you have stress in your life and you're traumatized, then you go into work, or your relationships with people might deteriorate, and there might be further anxieties then happening. You might be overprotective of your children, or different things like that can happen. And then there's something that you mentioned there about sense making. So I know this refers to the work maybe of Sadie Matlis. Before we go into that, is there any other results about your research then would be important for us to know now?
There is some interesting findings that we have with regards to loneliness as well.
Okay.
For example, I'll give you the rough overview. We are finding that there are different trajectories of loneliness, that if you're lonely, if you declare yourself to be lonely generally anyway, the pandemic really didn't have that much of an impact on you. But those of us who might say we're moderately lonely or sometimes lonely, then actually the pandemic had a really damaging effect compared to sort of previous 10 years. But that's the headline. Now I have to go write it. But that I thought was an interesting statistic also, that there was this, people often refer to another epidemic coming up, the loneliness one, that so many people are living on their own more than ever, particularly in the Western world. I haven't dabbled too much in that research, but I think that is something that is worth keeping an eye on as well. I think, and I'll bring it out in this paper and I'll see where my own research goes, but I think keeping an eye on that and how people in those kind of situations have borne the brunt of the pandemic and how they then continue life, I think that's also going to be quite interesting going forward.
So Raji, you talked about a collective trauma, and one of those collective traumas was terror. And I'm interested in that notion. What are your insights on that?
So terror bombings are another form of collective trauma. This idea that it's not a personal individual trauma, but it's something that affects a lot of people in society. So another line of research that I have also under review, I'm coming back, after my own childbearing years now, William, I've got a lot of papers that are just finally heading the right way. So we also know that, like the pandemic, which is a big global sort of health pandemic, terror bombings are also considered collective trauma because they are traumatizing for a lot of people who are witness to them. And oftentimes the research shows you don't have to be in the vicinity of a terror attack taking place. Even witnessing it as a vicarious sort of observer, someone who might live in the same city, you might see it on the news. You might learn about it through family members, through friends. It's because it's in the same country that you live in. That is also considered a form of collective trauma, in that it can be upsetting for people. It can be difficult for them to make sense of what has happened and how do they reconcile that when their assumptions about what life is, how life should be played out on a daily basis are in essence shattered. You've then got to reconfigure sort of what you know about how the world should be, why we're all taught that the world is a good place by and large, particularly as we're growing up, and we all want it to be a nice place for everyone to get along and live it together, etc., with minor disagreements along the way. But these collective events really shatter our assumptions, and sort of making sense of why they've happened is on everyone's mind. So some of my research has looked at trying to understand some of the natural things that people do during collective trauma. What is it that people who are vicariously observing this, what do they do? And one of the things that I found is that people want to share. They want to talk about what's happened with other people. In other words, they defect to others. And that's a real social psychological instinct that we all have. And research for decades and decades has testified to that under conditions of stress, one of the first things humans do is defect to others. Caregivers, whoever that might be, loved ones, friends, family. We want to feel comfort. We want to sort of sense make with them about what's happened and get that love and comfort and understanding from them. And so I've analysed a number of incidents in the UK over the past few years, terror bombings, knife attacks, as well as the current COVID pandemic. And there's an interesting pattern that we're noticing, and it doesn't make for joyful reading, forgive me. There'll be moments where I'm also looking at growth as well. But we are finding that when people defect to others, when they're seeking that emotional support immediately after witnessing, observing something collectively and traumatic happening, that doesn't always help people. The idea that the collective wisdom here is that share your feelings with somebody else. In fact, early on during the pandemic, a lot of the advice given to human beings across the world was, find a safe space, talk to other people about how you feel. Generally, that can be okay. But if those conversations end up reinforcing, recovering what's happened, to relive that negativity again and again, that can again be quite harmful and quite debilitating on people's health generally, where you walk away from those emotional connections actually feeling worse than you did when you first went to sort of share thoughts about what happened and seek that comfort. And that's not done on purpose. I don't think it can be, but I didn't find in my research that anyone goes out of their way to make anyone else feel terrible. But often if you're all in the same boat and if you're all talking about something, and in the early days, there's a lot of negativity there, a lot of anger perhaps even there, and that can make people ruminate. So you walk away from those encounters brooding on what's happened, thinking about it, playing it again and again in your head. That then can lead to sort of a negative impact on your own health. So yes, it is good to defect and talk, but sometimes that can backfire.
So my understanding is that it's seeking out people that you can talk in a healthy way to make sense of what happened, versus some people who may be going down in a negative downward spiral and kind of reinforcing the negatives, versus really what we should be doing is expressing our feelings, talking it through and trying to make sense of what's going on. And it's more of a healthier, encouraging type approach to those conversations. Is that what I'm getting from that?
Sort of, William. But I think what we're finding here, there was nothing malicious on the part of the person being talked to. Nobody was going out of their way to make anyone feel bad. But I think this might actually, and again, this is pending further research, I think during those initial sense-making encounters, what on earth has just happened? Isn't this terrible? Who is responsible for this atrocious event that's taken this many lives? I think the conversations early on just lend themselves. There are no easy answers here, but there's a lot of sort of dabbling in the reality of what's happened and making sense of those shattered assumptions. And that early process is so full of negative emotion. And quite naturally, I've also experienced exactly the same thing. There's anger, there's fear, there's anxiety, and those early connections can be a little bit more challenging on people's sort of mental health. I'm sure if I had tracked responses over a matter of time, I might have found a different trend, that perhaps those early conversations are just marked by making sense of all that fear and anger that arises in us immediately. But maybe over time that pacifies a little bit, actually. We might even argue that we need to go through that angry sort of fearful, anxious sense-making in order to reach an understanding a day, a week, a month, a year later. So I only looked at the initial impact. Research in your questions, great. Further research that I myself will undertake will try to unpick whether that state of affairs continues. long after, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after? My hunch is that it probably doesn't. I think as you mentioned the work of Sally Maitlis, who I greatly admire just early on, her own research shows that we can grow from trauma. And I think perhaps if I continued my research over time, we'd find that these early experiences that people were making sense of, they might not have been able to make sense of them in the immediate aftermath, but perhaps a week, 2 weeks, a month, even a year later, they can look back and process that in a different way so that actually those supportive encounters are indeed supportive rather than sort of backfiring. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I'm just curious then, with the work of Sally Maitlis, I know she talked about her research with post-traumatic growth and injured musicians. So I have a cousin, Anya Turl, in Australia, so I'm sure she's very interested in this. And that brings to mind of COVID, and maybe, let's say, doctors and nurses and emergency healthcare workers, whether it be in nursing homes or, GP surgeries or whatever, that they've been witness to a lot of death, a lot of illness, a lot more than they normally would due to, I suppose, the pandemic here. I suppose, what's your findings around that then?
I haven't specifically researched healthcare workers. I do actually, I'll come to talk about this study in just a moment when we talk about sort of more organisational trauma. I have a study there where I am looking more closely at nurses. That data, William, I also have to crunch through and analyse yet. You've caught me at sort of a research term where so many things are flying off at the shelf. But the research that I've read that's been conducted on healthcare workers, I think you're right to identify that they've been at the brunt of this. We talk about the mere mortals like the rest of us struggling, but I think those who have been the key workers have struggled a little bit more. And the volume of research on not only key workers, so that's teachers, firefighters, your refuge collectors, whatever it might be, all the way through to healthcare workers, nurses, paramedics, surgeons. I think they are at the brunt, and I think that research evidently shows that they have suffered a lot, their mental health, their physical health. If we go by recent reports of burnout and sickness absence in the healthcare sector, I'm talking for the UK here, but I imagine rates are very similar across the world. I think you're right. I think they've borne the brunt of this pandemic, really, haven't they? It's sad to see so many of them walking away as well. I was reading research the other day. So many of them are leaving, given the tough conditions and circumstances under which they've had to work and will continuously have to work. But without having gone through the rates, comparing them to my own sort of general analysis, they've probably suffered more. And I think when we think about making sense of their experiences and moving on from their experiences, you might argue that because they're in high trauma occupations, they continuously face trauma on a daily basis, right? Healthcare workers, like the likes of you and I, might experience traumatic things every now and then, just in the line of our work. But healthcare workers see it every day. You might argue that they experience it worse. Their perhaps burnout, stress levels are worse. Maybe they've learned over time to manage it better than the rest of us have as well. They must be doing something like that to stay in the jobs that they do. And I think it's worth noting that these people, like the musicians that you mentioned, and Sally Maitlis makes this point as well, there's a real calling for these people to do the work that they do. All the nurses that I've ever interviewed and worked with will all say that they feel they were born to do their work. You wonder whether that sense of calling helps absorb some of the trauma that they experience on a daily basis. I don't know the answer to that, but there's something about them that I think makes them manage this trauma on a daily basis probably better than other people do. And I guess, like everybody, there comes a limit and a time beyond which it's impossible to function with everything sort of going on. But I think you're right. They've borne the brunt of this pandemic.
It is that really sense of calling and that vocation.
Yeah.
And then we're talking about organisational trauma then, and the work of Sally Maitlis then. Like, tell me a little bit about her research, because she talks about, the different types of trauma at work, so post-traumatic growth at work, then what's important for us to know?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think from what we've covered so far, that's just one half of looking at sort of trauma, whether it's collective or more work-based. What is the impact on people? But there's another sort of part of this jigsaw, and that's the more optimistic. That sort of connects when I'm doing my own work and early work in this area, connects it sort of back to humanity and how wonderful human beings are and can be. And that's looking at sort of, can people bounce back from trauma? It's not just resilience, it's not just thriving. Those terms are similar, but a little bit different from post-traumatic growth as well. Growth is really taking some learning, some insight, some understanding from the negative experience that you've been through and really turning that around into something positive that continues with you throughout your life. So the work with injured musicians was really looking at the new positive identities that people who suffer a career-ending injury are able to craft and then sort of move on in their career and their life with. So you almost see the trauma over time as something that you grow from. And I think that's been hugely inspiring. I have many personal instances in life where I think I've done that without even knowing about it. So my own attraction to this area was that, they say research is a bit of me-search, don't they, William? We go through experiences and then we want to sort of figure out why we went through those and why we acted and reacted the way in which we did. So my own personal experiences talk oftentimes to trying to find some good in something bad that's happened and grow from it. And my mother taught me that. I don't know whether being from sort of an Indian, slightly spiritual background, it's always been about, okay, so bad's happened, now turn it around. What can you learn from that? How can you move forward? So that's been instilled in me from a really early age. And a few major experiences, everyone has them in their life, have made me think about that. And I got into this area by trying to figure out why it is and how it is that humans can do that. So Sally's work looks exactly, I call her Sally, Professor Sally Maitlis. I've not met her yet, but a real academic hero of mine, looks at how people craft positive identities in the wake of experiencing trauma. And I'm interested in that myself. How is it that people grow? And what we know is that people can grow, that people don't just stop when they experience trauma. It's painful, it's hurtful, it's stressful. People have to sense make. It takes a while to go through the process. But so many people come through the other end, showing growth potential, new identities, new ways of thinking, feeling, behaving, acting. And that's really super when we look at the other side of suffering, I guess. And so the huge interest in that. I was reading the work of Jonathan Haidt. I've always been so interested in his perspective on the happiness hypothesis. What does it take to be happy in life? And one of the chapters I read again and again and again is, do we need to experience adversity in order to be happy? And you know what? I'm going to put my hand up and say this is a personal reflection, not a research-based one, because I'm really far off from getting anywhere near that. Lots of other people have answered this in many different ways. But one of the insights from that chapter is actually maybe we do. That being hurt a little bit can sometimes be good for you because it can teach you a lot of things about what to do going forward in the future. It doesn't work for everybody, I'm pretty sure. So from a personal perspective here, I'd say actually, yeah. I've personally encountered that so many times, hence my interest in the area. So I look for those instances where elements of trauma can help, can encourage people to grow, and what that growth looks like. So I have so many questions to ask, actually, William, at the moment, and I've not even started researching, but there's so much there. We don't know enough about how people adjust in the face of adversity. Sally's paved the way. A few other researchers have been looking at post-traumatic growth as well, but it's an amazing area of research.
It is, and it's like that old saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
And I remember,
how many times have we told that growing up, eh?
Exactly. And I identify this as well. I've often spoken on the podcast about different experiences I've had, and I've come to view these as a gift. It allows me to help my clients in a different way, or to get a different insight, or to gain more empathy with people, or that connection to really understand what's going on for them. So I've reframed that now, and that brings me then back to the work of Sandy Maitlis, because I have a diagram in front of me here, which I think is fascinating, where it goes through that traumatic event, where that assumptive world, we have these core beliefs that, as you said, get shattered. And there's a bit of emotional security there that gets shattered along with it. Would that be right in saying?
Yeah. I think I know which diagram you're talking about. Yes, that lovely colourful one.
Exactly. It's figure one I'm talking about. And it talks about disruption, dysregulation, growth cycle, and outcomes. So if we could talk about that, because when I saw this first, I was going, oh, wow, this is a wonderful model to share with people. So could we talk about that, if that's okay with you?
Absolutely. Alrighty. So do you want to share the diagram, or do we just talk about it generally?
Yeah, we'll just talk about generally.
Generally. Okay. So the idea is, and I've sort of alluded to this as we've been speaking, William, and this, we can perhaps share this if anybody's interested. This is from Sally's chapter just a very short while ago. And the diagram here refers to a traumatic event as shattering people's assumptions of the world. And what that means is that we all have an idea of what the world is meant to be like. It's meant to be a good place. So when bad things happen, we're left thinking about what on earth just happened? Why would something bad happen? So you're questioning yourself. You're questioning what's happened and trying to make sense of it, trying to put some perspective on what it is that's happened. The impact of that is that it can cause people to ruminate. It can cause them to think. This is sort of what my own research in the terror bombing, etc., was showing, that people, when they're trying to make sense of what's happened, they're thinking about it again and again in their heads. Many of us are entertaining thoughts about what's happened, and we're probably doing this more than we should. We're doing it when we're sitting working, we're making a cup of tea, we might be doing it when we're asleep, but we're pondering on this. It's on our minds. It can disrupt our emotions. These sort of broken assumptions can make us feel fearful, scared, anxious, lacking in hope. That in turn can affect how we regulate our emotions, how we respond to things that are happening. So we're trying to sort of make ourselves whole and understand what's happening, but it's a challenge to the way that we think. It's a challenge to the way that we feel as well. But when we think about, so that process has been established, research shows that, but when we look at how growth happens, and the model that Sally has in this paper talks about how growth occurs through a cycle of emotion regulation and sense making. You have to understand your emotions. You have to try and make sense of what is going on in the world, thinking about your own schemas of what kind of a place the world is, matching that to what's happened, gauging some form of peacemaking there, if you will. When that starts to happen, it can have an impact on your well-being. It can have an impact on sort of physiological things to do in your body, good or bad. Bad meaning it can disrupt your sleep. Rumination often disrupts your sleep. Well-being can be affected. And I found that in my own research with collective trauma, whether we're talking about the pandemic, whether we're talking about terror attacks, one of the initial impact on people is that it affects their health and their physiological and psychological health. But there's also over time this thing called growth that happens as well. And growth is really important because it's enabled by a number of things. Some of us can grow just from the thinking that we're doing. It's sort of a self-managed thing. But as the work of Sally shows in this diagram, growth often occurs through the relationships that we have with others, the support that you get from the people around you, the support that you might get from work and the work relationships, the companionship that you have at work, the people that you can rely on to listen to you, to engage with you in dialogue, to make sense of what's happened. And when these things happen well, it leads to this idea of growth. And in the workplace, that's about giving you a positive work identity. So something bad has happened. How can I turn that around and make something positive out of it. I'm a new person now because of this. In the same way, it can positively impact your career, and it can impact the kind of leader that you are, or your engagement with leaders at work. So that's sort of what the process is showing. And it's nice because I think it goes through the immediate impact to sort of the other side of it as well. And I love the idea of growth, William. I think that people do it, but we just don't talk about it enough. We have to do it as humans, right? Nothing at work, nothing in life is devoid of bad things happening. And the fact that so many of us carry on means that we're probably doing something right along the way, even if we don't articulate that actually we've learned from this and we're moving forward with it. So I love this work.
I think it's fascinating, and I like the point you make about companionship and the occupational sports within the workplace, whether that be coaching or your best friend at work. So all engagement surveys will talk about having that best friend at work. And again, when we talk about workplace, a lot of my work, and I'm sure your work when it comes to individual coaching, is sometimes people have these adverse childhood experiences or trauma that come into the workplace. And when you mentioned about leadership, then put a pandemic on top of that, and that collective trauma that's going on, then as a leader, then I'm layering up the trauma, haven't I? So that means there's more, I suppose, occupational supports that I require to be able to be successful in my role. And a lot about this research, I really like that when you mentioned there that positive work identity, we've gone through this together, look what we have achieved. And again, for some people then, it gets them to reevaluate their career. They're sometimes being more proactive to say, listen, I need to enhance my digital skills, or actually, you know what, I mightn't be playing to my strengths here in my role, and it's really been highlighted there. So this is where there's an opportunity then for leaders to actually be even more connected to employees. And I think there's greater demands on leaders now to be more proactive with connecting with direct reports and employees. What are your thoughts on that?
I think so, William. There has been a bit of research that's looked at the impact on the leader as well. So there's a couple of things here. Leaders are at the forefront of managing people who have been through trauma. So we can only imagine the burdens on them as well. And perhaps the recent pandemic has made their job even tougher than normal, dealing with people who themselves might have been struggling for any reason. So there's probably a lot more that leaders themselves, and this is in my consulting practice that I am finding, and you probably are as well, William, that leaders are having to do a lot more of what we call those soft skills, which, they're not soft at all. They're really important. They're as important as any other skills, but a lot more compassion. And this builds on research on compassionate organizations that has been conducted for the past couple of decades, that organizations where employees are treated with care and compassion, particularly when they've been through trauma, etc., employees then feel more satisfied in their jobs. So I think now more than ever, organizations and their sort of representatives are going to have to, hopefully they're already doing it, but if not, dig a little bit deeper and find that compassion and care. There's a lot of us that are going to be needing that, but particularly as people are heading back into work. A lot has been done virtually as we go back into the workplace. I think a lot more, in addition to the work itself, but it's those conversations that you have with workers. It's that care and understanding of not just their work, but themselves that come to work, and ourselves, if you will, is comprised of more than just our work identities, right? It's everything, all the baggage that we bring on a daily basis, all the baggage and all the trauma experience the last couple of years. So I think so many people going back into work, there'll be that confused emotions, those confused thoughts about what's been going on. Has this just been a really bad dream, and now we're back trying to take off from where we were a year or 2 years ago? So people are probably more confused, perplexed, nervous, anxious, scared than ever before. And I think it's incumbent on leaders to show more of that compassion and care than ever before. That will take care of, demonstrating that sort of compassion, it reassures people, doesn't it? And I think if you want citizenship, if you want commitment from workers, then demonstrating more and more of that, particularly at this time, is going to be in leaders' interests, really. Without making it sound like it's...
You are, and I'm trying to make sense of this. So there are certain people I might talk to go, I'm already overloaded. I'm trying to meet the strategic objectives as the organisation. I'm overwhelmed myself, and then they might be putting up boundaries to say, I don't really want to know.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to do that self-protection piece. So is there maybe is it that the demands and the level of expectations for leaders to be more compassionate now than maybe previously thought, where, like you said there, we want someone to care about us, not just from a personal or professional point of view, but a personal point of view?
I think so. I think they probably are. And I think, again, this is just anecdotal things that I've read. William, I can't claim to have researched this myself yet. But I think there are. When I think about my own occupation and going back into the workplace, I think there is this sort of defecting to leaders to show the way a little bit and sort of pacify people, help them out when they're struggling, their sense making. But the flip side of that, I think when you've hinted that this, the demands placed on leaders to show the way, and there is higher now, probably more than ever, but they're also in the same boat as us, right? And I think the danger here is that when we rely on leaders, for example, in the workplace to help people by trying to mitigate their suffering, leaders themselves can end up absorbing all of that, right? They can end up taking in all of this negativity, all of the toxic emotions, if you will, in the workplace. And I think that's even harder for them to deal with. So we might see leaders being even more burnt out because they're trying to sort of manage not only themselves, but also their workforce as well. Research has shown that in the past. I wonder whether I can probably guess that it's going to get a bit more heightened as everyone goes back into work and everyone's dealing with sort of making sense of what the past 2 years has shown us. But I think it's worth keeping an eye on our leaders as well, for sure, and helping them where we can.
Yeah, I've been working with a group lately, and we had a major theme throughout a series of workshops. We were doing a leadership development program, and self-care time and time again came up. And I think there needs to be a certain amount of personal responsibility. And also as leaders, we need to know where to draw the line. Am I fully equipped to have this conversation? I think we need to have enough of a conversation to understand the context, and that we can understand what people are going through. And then that's where we signpost people to the experts or the supports or coaching or employment assistance programs. Would that be your theory or approach, or would you have something different to mind?
No, I think that sounds really reasonable and sensible. In my own consulting practice, I'm finding very similar things. I think right now more than ever, leaders are really vulnerable. I think they're having to show the way, but they're also in the same boat as everybody else. And so keeping an eye on them, I think, is as important as on their sort of health, etc., is as important as keeping an eye on the work that they're doing by managing everybody else. And trying to prevent leader burnout, I think, is going to be really, really important as well. I liked your notion of self-care, though. I think that's really, really insightful. I've also have something in the pipeline around self-care, but particularly with nurses. Again, it's in those occupations, and perhaps leadership is also one of them when we think of organisations themselves, but in the calling occupations like healthcare, or indeed, any occupation that we're drawn to, self-care is so important, isn't it? And I think so many of us forget to do that. I've heard it used a lot in conversations during the pandemic. Take care of yourself. You've got to take care of yourself. Find half an hour, go for a walk, meditate, listen to some music, have a mug of tea, whatever it might be. I just wonder how many of us have forgotten to do that. I'm sure many people have done it quite well, but many of us with lots of competing demands on our times, lots of things to juggle with, we don't do enough of that, do we really? Enough of sitting down and taking care of ourselves, whether it's a leader or not. I do think it's so important. Practically, I see that people are crying out for it. Strategies, how can I be more mindful? How can I engage more in something, some therapy, whatever it is, that will help me feel better, will help me feel less anxious about what might come tomorrow, given the sort of up and down of the past 2 years. But I don't know what you think, William, but self-care is so hard to teach people, isn't it? We're not very good at taking care of ourselves, and particularly those of us who take care of others all the time, right? It's so hard. It shouldn't be. It sounds obvious. Go for a walk, have a long bath, read a book. But, you know, when you're so drowned at the end of the day, where do you find the time to do that?
A really important point you're making here, and I'm glad we're having this discussion.
Yeah, me too.
A couple of episodes ago, there's a business psychotherapist called Naomi Shragay,
yes,
of the Financial Times as well. And we were talking about her book, The Man Who Mistook His Job for His Career. And
yes.
It's really about understanding what is driving your behavior. So if it is that workaholism, like if that's solving a problem, there's a reward in that for you. And I think from a leadership perspective, sometimes we're nearly seeking permission from others. Is it okay if I take a break or something like that? And I think there needs to be a reframe where leaders are encouraging people, because then we're going back into, transference, isn't it? Where we see authority figures as like the adults or parents in our relationship. We need to be adult ourselves to say, okay, and a point I made to a group was, when it comes to self-care, is if you're thirsty, you go for a coffee or drink. If you're hungry, you go for lunch or you have a snack. And the same way with self-care is you need to take time out or a breath. We need to start treating it that way and be more disciplined, a bit like we have our coffee break at 11 o'clock. What is it that we do for self-care? And that brings then for nurses there, because it's so full on in hospitals right now. What is your findings about self-care with nurses that we might be, our listeners might be interested in?
In progress. But as with everything else we're talking about. But I think, one of the most interesting things, I'm going to be a little bit critical here, and you might have found this too, William, but I think it's all good and well telling workers to adopt more self-care practices, to be more self-caring. But if the culture doesn't permit them to do so, or encourage them to do so, or indeed allow them to do so, then, how does that happen? And I think what I'm hearing from the nurses that I'm speaking to is, yes, we know about it. Yes, we know we should do this. We know we should do that. A, when do I find the time? And B, when I do it, it's often frowned upon. And I know that from my own personal experiences. If you work in a culture where if you're seen to have a half an hour off for your lunch to go for a walk or actually not even be at your desk, if that's frowned upon, then how on earth do you do self-care? So I think people have to, within yourself, that if it matters to you, I know for a lot of people for whom self-care is so important that they will put times in their diary, block things out. This is my hour. Nothing will go here. I will do whatever it is that I need to do to take care of myself. I will not entertain calls, meetings, whatever it might be. Some people don't do that. And we don't need to be given permission to take care of ourselves. But I think if so many of us are working in a culture where it's looked down on if you're not available all the time, or if you're seen to be weak if you take time out for yourself, then I think that's a real problem, isn't it? And I think without general, I think that's a big problem, isn't it?
It is. And I'm glad you mentioned that culture, because sometimes it's lip service, isn't it? We're telling you what you want to hear. The reality is we might be actually under-resourced, or I suppose underperformance from others is being tolerated. And again, that's not being addressed. So other people are carrying their workload. And again, that frowning piece of, you're on a half day.
Yeah.
Even though
that's it, right?
you could have started at 7 o'clock and you're finishing at 3:30 or something like that.
Yeah.
So there is that socialization piece where there has to be a demonstration from leadership and all senior leaders that they're doing that. And science shows, the evidence does show, and I don't know if you've done similar research there, we're more productive when we take self-care breaks. We're more innovative because that creativity happens.
Yeah.
And we make better decisions. We're good at problem solving. We improve communications, overall productive. And my work, I'm also a mediator as well.
Yeah.
So when we're in conflict, or there's an internal conflict going on within ourselves, if we're doing conflict coaching, for example, I think that's where people sometimes don't see the benefits of self-care.
Yeah.
They kind of see it as something that's selfish. Whereas if you're in an airplane, what would the people, the cabin crew, tell you to do is actually take the oxygen for yourself. Mind yourself first before you take care of others.
Yeah.
So
the idea of selfish really rings true from the data that I have. I'm in progressing with nurses. They see it as selfish taking time out for themselves. And you know what? I get that, because sometimes I do too, personally, I really do. Yeah. If I take time out for myself during the day, I'm speaking for myself and others close to me, especially time away from children. You feel guilty for it. Now, what have I done to deserve a half hour to myself? I could be doing this. Yeah. Isn't that strange? Isn't it strange that for so many of us, and I think this is not just work culture, but just cultures in which we've grown up, what society tells us is okay to do and not. And oftentimes self-care is associated with indulging. It's something that you're doing that you don't need to do, and it's indulging, it's unnecessary, it's sort of excessive. And that's not the case, is it? But having said that, William, I just thought of something really interesting. And again, this is anecdotal insights that I've gauged through talking to lots of people, some for research, some just personal connections. I do think, coming back to this idea of post-traumatic growth and insights during trauma, how many people do you know that are doing something different and positive off the back of the trauma? The collective trauma of COVID-19, having to stay at home, work from home, it has been hard for so many people, undoubtedly. But how many of us forced into that situation have actually come away with different strategies about managing ourselves, our houses, our children, our work, whatever it is, and we're still not letting go of those good things that we've adopted, whether it's that half-hour walk in the morning, whether it's saying, no, I am not available after 5 o'clock to take any calls, and I'm going to do that twice a week, no meetings on these days. These downtimes have forced many people to adopt habits. And I think it's because necessity breeds innovation, right? We had nowhere to go. We're getting so stressed. We cannot be on Zoom meetings 5 days a week, 24 hours a day. It's just not possible. It forces so many people to put time, restrictions, strategies in place to better manage themselves and be better for the people that they love. And that's been a really, really interesting insight. I don't know if we can call it growth per se, but we can definitely call it, when you push to your limits, you can also click for the better. And this I think I've seen a lot of self-care actually being thrust upon people. You've been forced to almost arise out of it, and you have to cope. So I think that's been a massive insight. And I've seen people do all sorts of things. I've put blockers in my own diary with him. I have these couple of times a week where I'll go, between you and I and your listeners, I'll go for a run and I'll block it out in my diary 15 minutes before, 15 minutes after, so I can warm up and cool down and breathe and I won't compromise that, because if that slips 1 week, it slips the next week, and before you know it, it's been 6 months before you've taken any care of your physical health. And that's some of the changes that I've made in my own life. And I don't know if you have too, but there's always a silver lining there somewhere.
I think there is, and it recalls to mind the work of Carol Dweck of Growth Mindset, isn't it? It's always okay. What am I learning about this?
Yes.
It's not always about the outcome; it's about the process. And I think from your sharing of how you've changed, I think many people have changed, and I think there's a big fear from people, especially about returning to the office. Now that's going to disappear. My walk
Yeah.
is going to disappear. And this is where there's a real emphasis now on that flexibility of work. And this is part of, I think, the organizational support to help us with this trauma back into the workplace is
Yeah.
we need to be very strategic in how we're bringing people back in. So we've done this a recent episode with Kelly Yost, and she gives us a lot of information about that. So I might direct the listeners towards that.
Yeah.
So we are coming to the end of our podcast today, Raji. It is.
Are we?
It has flown by from the
Nice.
time we first met back in 2013. I'm so glad we have kept in touch.
Me too. My gosh, it's nearly been 10 years. Wow.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it? And I have to say, you were so instrumental in my learning. It's great that you were my tutor there. So thank you so much for that. And do say hello to Jackie Coyle Shapiro. Did I say that right? Sorry, Dr. Jackie, I forgot. And sorry for Professor Sally. Professor, apologies. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. What I'd like to do is to give you an opportunity, if people to reach out to you, how might they do so?
They can find me on LinkedIn, or they could email me at Birkbeck. Should I share my email address?
That'd be great if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, of course. It's a complicated one. I might write it at the bottom of you might have to scribble it somewhere. But you can find me on the Birkbeck pages. But it's r.Dhensa-Kahlon, so DHENSA -KAHLON at bbk.ac.uk. That's a long one.
That is a long one.
I try so hard to abbreviate it, and then it just doesn't work. It ends up being too short.
Okay.
There we go.
Raji, thank you so much for joining the Workplace Podcast today.
Thank you so much, William. It's been a real pleasure to have caught up with you again and have you interested in some of the research I'm doing. So thank you.
That's it for this episode of the Workplace Podcast. My special thanks to this week's guest for a wonderful discussion. If you want to get in contact with the podcast about a workplace topic or a particular challenge that you're facing, contact me via Twitter at different paths. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, William Corless, CORLESS, or go to my website, www.yellowwood.ie. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Provider executive coaching, facilitation and training. Take a different path to success with your career, leadership, team and organisation.